Hey friends, so on this channel I have a chapter or playlist dedicated to the complete beginner's guide to watercolor. And I wanted to, in this video, do a deep dive on the top 3 most common questions I get about watercolor. I've been teaching watercolor for almost a decade now. From in-person workshops, I've been teaching through my books, my everyday watercolor books. I did a book tour where I taught in person in Singapore and Australia, Canada, Europe, and all over the US. And now through my YouTube channel for the past 2.5, 3 years, I've been teaching you guys watercolor every single week, releasing new videos. And by far throughout those in-person workshops and traveling around, meeting new people from all different countries and parts of the world, and then through the virtual world and comments we get on our videos, these 3 questions we get are the most popular or the most common. So in this video, we're going to be talking about water control or consistency of water and pigment ratio. We're going to be talking about color mixing and how to pull out undertones and values and hue differences within colors. And then third, we're going to talk about detail work and negative space. This is kind of like a whole in-depth beginner's guide, complete beginner's guide to the 3 most common questions I get about watercolor from the last almost decade that I've been teaching watercolor. So if you're ready for a very eye-opening video, then let's dive in. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 most common questions I received about watercolor. And the first one is going to be about water to pigment ratio. And I'm just going to kind of summarize this and call it the consistency of your paint and water on your brush or on your paper. How much water should I have on my brush, or how much is too much, etc. This is a very common question, and I wanted to bring it back to the basics here and do this exercise called tea to butter. I learned this technique or this practice on consistency from Brienne M, but this is a very common exercise on consistency from many like traditional watercolor teachers or watercolor teachers out there with workshops and things. So this is a really great exercise for any level of watercolorist to do. A lot of especially beginner watercolorists will just kind of jump right to working with paint straight out of the tube and just focusing on what they're painting. However, 75% of what you actually do as a painter or as a watercolorist should be about observing and developing technique and the foundations of things. So if you've never done an exercise like this on water consistency or paint to water pigment ratio, then this is going to be very fascinating and eye-opening for you, I believe. So this is going to explain a lot about values. It's going to explain a lot about wet on wet and wet on dry. So when I learned this was very eye-opening. All right, so tea and butter. Literally think about the consistency of tea, and it's going to be on a scale all the way to butter. So I'm just going to circle out. You don't even have to really circle this out, but just kind of so I make sure I have enough space. I'm just going to, you can do squares or circles. Pencil in lightly 5 circles or squares. These are going to be my little, where I'm going to place my swatches. And it's also good to pencil this out too, because you're then going to see where the pencil starts to show through the swatch on the more transparent swatches. And you can use any type of brush. I'm going to use a size 16 to get this going, because you can obviously, with your bigger brushes, you're going to hold a lot more water. With a synthetic sable brush, or the Aqua Elite series from Princeton is also a really great brush for holding a lot of water. These brushes that hold a lot more water are going to be great for using the more tea and coffee is going to be our next one. Consistencies, because those are going to be used for a lot of big sweeping washes over your entire sheet of paper and things like that. So I would use, or I would do this exercise with a darker color so that you can see it. In a lot of your lighter colors, the values aren't really going to shift all that much. It's just going to be a thicker consistency, but you're not going to see much of a shift in the actual color or the value. So I'm going to use Prussian blue. I'm going to use Prussian blue, but first I'm going to write out what these are. So our first consistency is going to be tea, and then we have coffee. Next will be milk. think like whole milk, something like a thicker milk, and then cream, heavy cream, and butter. And in this range is going to be a really great practice on understanding consistency for your pigment and water. So then I'm going to go ahead and mix these up. So I'm going to use Prussian blue as my color. Again, use something darker, Prussian blue, and sap grains, Scarlet Light could work, even black. Tea. Let's think about steeped tea and what that looks like. You know, if you were to literally spill some tea on your paper, it's very watery. The consistency, you can see through it through the coloring of the tea from the leaves in the tea. So it's not very dark. It's more transparent. And that's the thing with watercolor. With other painting mediums like oil or acrylic, you don't really have to think about consistency because you just kind of work with the paint from the tube and you lighten it with white or however you're mixing your colors. But with watercolor, we have to be more of a student of the consistency of the pigment and water combinations. And a lot of people just kind of skip over that and don't really practice it. So think about what tea looks like. Looking at it in my palette, this looks like a very, obviously when I hold my palette up, that's going to be a good example of how it runs. And most of you are going to notice that my palette is kind of wicking away the paint and water, and that's totally normal. And that will wear off once you build up your mixture and then over time, but don't worry about it. So this is looking really good. It's looking, and obviously if I want to cover my whole sheet of paper with this consistency, with this tea consistency, then I'm gonna make a really large batch of this. But right now I'm just doing this little circle. So this is a very good tea mixture, and I'm gonna hold it up and do the test in my palette to see how it runs. So obviously it's running really quickly. So the drops of the mixture are running very rapidly as I lift my palette. So that is what tea would do if I had it in a palette or on paper or whatever. So, and then, whoops, there's some red still left over in this mixing well. So that's why it's gonna look a little purple. But if you wanna make sure, if you're also testing colors, then obviously use a clean mixing well. So we've got a good tea mixture, and now we're gonna test it on our paper to see what it looks like on paper. So again, this is the tea consistency, and this is really good for your lighter values of colors, especially the darker pigments, so blues, blacks, even some reds, greens. These, you know, are your wash colors that you're going to cover. Like if you're painting an ocean scene, let's say, and you have a large area to cover, this is your big broad washes. But also if you look closely, you can see the pencil lines underneath this swatch. So your lighter values are more transparent. You're going to see through them, and therefore you're going to notice the pencil lines. Next, we're going to mix up our coffee. So technically coffee and tea obviously use about the same amount of water. If you have an 8-ounce cup, you're going to have an 8-ounce amount of water for both. And it's the staining that darkens the value of the coffee versus the tea. So I'm just grabbing a little bit more of my Prussian blue mixture and adding it to my tea mixture and building it up with a little bit more water too. But as I'm looking at it in my palette, I can see that I'm seeing through it less than I was with the tea. And we can do the running test, and it's still dripping very rapidly, but just a little bit less transparent than my tea mixture. So there's not much difference between running between your tea and your coffee consistency. It's darker. So we're adding a little bit more pigment to it and just a touch more water so it stays pretty, pretty runny like coffee would be. But again, it's darker than tea. I'm just gonna grab a little bit more water. And this is, again, for those of you who are really new to watercolor, doing that running test in your palette is a really good idea of how thick the mixture is or the consistency. And so as I place this on my paper, obviously it's a darker value, but it's also getting a little bit thicker, but not noticeably thicker where we're seeing any sort of dry brush effect, which we'd get in the more cream and butter stage. These two values I would use for my lightest values when I'm painting either a realistic, scene or florals. My lighter values are going to be in the tea and coffee range consistency wise. So you can even pencil that in here. These are my light values. And different pigments will give you different range, kind of range with your values. So if I were using lemon yellow deep for this exercise, for example, you wouldn't see as stark of a difference between each, tea, coffee, milk, cream, butter consistency. So it would be light yellow to dark yellow, but it's not as much of a range with these darker colors. So that's another exercise you can do, is practicing it with multiple different pigments. And then next, we're going to get into the milk stage of consistency. So this, again, is more of like a whole milk. And if you were to picture like when you accidentally spill some milk on the counter or whatever, it's a little bit thicker than tea and coffee, and it's less transparent. So we are adding more Prussian blue and not much more water. I'm going to add just a tad so it's not getting too dried out, because that would be in our cream and butter stage. But we are getting that whole milky consistency. And these different stages in consistency are going to react differently as well when you are painting with wet on wet or wet on dry. You're going to want to use your thicker consistency stages for wet on dry effect, which is going to give you that dry brush look. And I'll show you some examples in a second. But also each one of these consistency stages are going to react differently to a wet paper surface. So if I'm using wet on wet and I have water or a light wash down on this section of my paper, and I punch in a color that's more like the tea consistency, it's going to spread like crazy. But if I do it with the butter consistency, it's going to stay pretty much right in that range where I placed it on my paper and get a little fuzzy on the outside, but it's going to stay pretty crisp. And then somewhere in between here is usually where I like to place in more of my wet and wet stuff, depending on how much I want it to spread and blend and diffuse. So our milk consistency, we're doing a little palette test. It's still running, but it takes a second to drip. It's not running as quickly as like tea and coffee. Again, it's running and dripping, but it's not like I have to hold it for a second now and then it drips. So here's our whole milk. And again, the consistency, it's thicker and that makes the value darker. This is when you start to not see the pencil lines underneath. So a lot of people ask me, this is another common question just to answer it. A lot of people ask me how I get rid of the pencil lines underneath the watercolor. And I always know ahead of time, or usually know ahead of time, if it is going to be covered up with the consistency of values that I'm going to use in that specific painting. If it's not, then I will either not use any pencil at all or sketch as lightly as I possibly can. But usually I sketch before painting, knowing ahead of time that I'm going to be able to cover it up with these milk and cream and butter consistencies that I'm using. So the next is our cream mixture. This is where we start to get a lot thicker. It's going to feel really, buttery, but not butter consistency quite yet. The cream is probably my favorite consistency to paint with. So I'm going to, instead of going to my water cup to grab more water, I'm going to be very careful to not add any more water at this stage to the mixture I have over here in my mixing well. And I'm going to grab a kind of like a tacky amount on my brush, amount of pigment or more Prussian blue, and then mix that in there. And this is when it starts to really not move much when you do the drip test. So I can kind of tell how it's moving in my palette by just swirling my brush around, that I need a little bit more. I want it to be a little bit thicker, but not too much to where it's that buttery, dry brush look. So at this stage, I'm going to test it out, see how it's looking. And it's still a little bit too drippy, so we're going to continue to grab more pigment. And you can even work with wet pigment straight from the tube too, to get these thicker consistencies, creamy and butter consistencies. And it's a slower drip. A little bit more. That's good. Very slow drip. All right. And so with our cream consistency, we are very dark with the color, and you see how I lift my brush off and nothing is moving. Like this is still a puddle. This is more like a really dark glaze of paint. I love this consistency. And you basically, when you cover that pigment over the surface area, you can't see through it. There's no transparency. So these are going to be your darker values. Your coffee and milk midtones. And then your milk and cream midtones to dark. And then obviously cream and butter are going to be dark tones. So for your butter consistency, you're going to wash that brush off completely and get rid of, soak up all of that water in your brush. And with Prussian blue, I do dry my pigments in my palette ahead of time, but with Prussian blue, it's still a very sticky and tacky-like color in your palette, even when it's dried. Actually, most of these colors are, so this will work, but you can also do this to get the butter consistency a lot easier if you're just grabbing paint straight from the tube and grabbing a little bit of water, just like barely touching it. And this is gonna be for your darkest tones. It's also gonna give you a lot of texture. It's not gonna cover the full surface area in the circle that I'm gonna do. When you're picking it up on your brush in your palette, it's gonna spread the hairs of your brush around, and it's gonna feel really heavy and tacky. So that means, of course, if you're wanting these tea and coffee and milk consistencies, that you need more water on your brush with the way it's feeling and looking on the paper. But again, the butter consistency is used for those darker values, your darkest values, and then obviously, like if you want the dry brush effect. So you can obviously pick up a lot of pigment a lot sooner with going straight from the tube, but if you roll around quite a bit in these dried pigments, if they're still kind of sticky, tacky-like when they're wet, you can do it as well. So very, very dry. It's like spreading butter on toast, scraping it around. And I love doing dry brush when it calls for it, for that rough texture, because again, with watercolor, we're not using white paint to lighten our colors. We're using water, or you can get these textures from a dry brush look to maybe light on water effect, like a glistening light on the ocean or something like that. So those little peaks of the watercolor paper poking through the color are what's going to show that light effect or glistening light effect, or just give you a nice texture in whatever you're painting. And then these are going to be your darkest values. So the tea to butter consistency exercise is a great way of really feeling and observing your consistencies when you're painting anything, your landscapes, florals, portraits, animals, doesn't matter. So it's really all about being more of a student of, an observer of how things feel and how things look before actually just going for it and hoping that it looks light or it looks dark or whatever. So being a student and understanding consistency is a really big part of painting with watercolor. Okay, so obviously this exercise is very eye-opening. It's also really cool to know, but how do we apply it and how does it affect what we're painting? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how each one of these consistencies responds on water. So again, with watercolor, consistency is a very important part or thing to understand, but also how the consistency of what you have on your brush reacts to a dry surface versus a wet surface. So we already know how it reacts to a dry surface. Our paper that we're painting on is dry. And then this could also have a layer of dried paint underneath it. And you would be able to see the underneath pigment underneath the tea and the coffee ranges and maybe even milk. But underneath these, you wouldn't see it because they're thicker. But let's just talk about how these consistencies or ranges of consistencies will react to wet and wet. So I'm gonna just kind of glaze over with clean water or cleanish water on this section of my paper right here. And then we're gonna show how each one of these consistencies responds. So using a wash brush or a flat brush would cover the surface a lot quicker, but I'm just going to make sure that my surface feels like tea or coffee so that it stays wet for a longer period of time. Because again, if we go into these milk and cream consistencies, first of all, it's going to be less transparent, so I won't be able to see the lighter colors on top, but it will also dry a lot quicker. It won't move the pigment on top as much. So if you want a lot of spread and a lot of blending to happen, you want the base layer to not only be a consistency that's in the tea and coffee range, but a lot of blend with the pigment on top is going to happen more with the coffee and tea ranges. So I'm going to start with butter and work backwards. So butter, we barely have any water on our brush. We're grabbing lots of pigment so that it's really, really thick. And I'm going to place that right here and kind of work my way down so you can see how it diffuses. So this is obviously butter and it diffuses, but it's not spreading. Let's go a little bit thicker and darker. So it diffuses a little bit, but it's not spreading. And obviously there's a little bit of a puddle right there from the base layer. So it's kind of picking that up, but butter, it just kind of diffuses the edges of the stroke or the shape, whatever you paint. And then cream, which I already have mixed up over here, is a little bit more watery. We'll go right here. And it automatically spreads a whole lot more than our butter consistency. And then same with milk. We're adding some water because I'm working backwards from where I ended. Milk, it's lighter and it's spreading easier. I really like how the cream is spreading. So it's getting kind of in these veins, whereas milk is getting a little bit wild. And then same thing with coffee and tea. They'll just be way bigger. So we got our coffee mixture. Much lighter. And then our tea, also lighter. And by the time these two last ones dry, they'll be spread probably into each other. So you're not going to see any separation. So again, if you only want a little bit of the blending or diffused look, you want your consistency on your brush to be more in the cream, maybe milk, but cream area. And then obviously the least is going to be butter. So like, for example, if I'm painting the background of this whale shark, which is a chapter in my book that's coming out in summer 2023 called Everyday Watercolor Oceans, the background is very blending. It's very diffused, spread pretty automatically and very quickly. That was because the consistency was more in the coffee range. However, this black didn't diffuse as much and it was probably more of a milk or a cream. And these waves, another chapter in my upcoming book, on top to show the shadows on the waves. This was all wet and dry. But if you want to show some soft blending between your shadows on your waves and the underneath layer than you would do wet and wet, but using more of a buttery or cream consistency. So there's a lot of magic that can happen, a lot of nuance that can happen with the consistency of your paint and your water ratios in your palette and on your brush. So practice this, see how it reacts on a wet surface versus a dry surface, and try out different pigments, because blue, Prussian blue in my palette spreads really nicely, whereas a color more like aqua rose or even sap green, they don't spread as quickly or as nicely as some other colors. So practice it out. Practice these two exercises, and this will really help you develop and understand what consistency, the different consistencies will get you in results with watercolor. Okay, so the next most common question I've received this last year about watercolor is about mixing paint. So in this exercise, we talked about water and pigment. So mixing water and pigment and the ratios, the consistency. The same kind of steps are going to be applied to mixing two colors together. So within mixing two colors, three colors, however many colors, you're also going to want to think about consistency. So we want to start here because that's going to build our foundation for consistency and also values. Because the thing with mixing and color and understanding color is, if you really dive deep into the world of color theory, which I've covered in multiple videos on this channel, and I cover a lot in my books, everyday watercolor books. But the thing with mixing colors is you're not just talking about the hue or the actual color. So if you look at a traditional color wheel or any color wheel online, you'll see, the red, blue, and yellow are your primary colors. Secondary colors are blue, orange, and green. And then you have your tertiary colors, which are your hyphenated names like red, orange, or yellow, orange. And those are leaning towards one primary color or the other, depending on the ratio of the pigments that you have, or the consistency and ratio of those pigments. But along with hue, you have obviously value. So the consistency of water that you have to that mixture of those colors is going to determine how light that value is or how dark that value is of that color. And then, so like this wheel, for example, has a dark value of blue and midtones, and then your lighter tones. And then you get that with your oranges, your greens, or whatever color you're mixing up. With the more water you have on your mixture, you're gonna have a lighter versus a darker. But then along with that, you have temperature. So there are, for example, there are warm and cool colors. If you split a color wheel from your yellow all the way to your red, violet, those are going to be your warm colors. And then you have your blues and greens, and blue, violet is going to be your cool colors. But not even that, even more to that. And I'm only going to briefly talk about this, but you have warm greens and cool greens. So if we look at this color mixing chart, which I'll explain how to do in a second, you're going to have some greens that are way more cool. So like this turquoise and yellow combination will give you a blue undertone. So temperature of the color is going to be really important to notice, versus sap green mixed with cadmium orange is going to give you a brownish, reddish undertone. So that would be a warm green. So within colors, you have warm and cool versions of those colors. And I mentioned this in this exercise up here, but understanding color and undertones, temperature, warm and cool, and consistency is going to be really important. And so I already mentioned this before, but 75% of what you do as a painter is in observation. So looking at the scene that you're painting, maybe you're painting an ocean seascape like this one, and noticing what time of day it is, and where the sun or where the light source is and how it's hitting the water. What undertones do you see in the ocean? Do you see any warm tones? Do you see mostly cool tones? How light do the lights get, and how dark do the darks get? And that will affect how you mix color and how you pull out color from the photo you're referencing or from the actual subject. So obviously, consistency is important in color mixing, because you understand the value of the color, and then also the combination or the undertones that you are seeing from your reference will inform what two colors or multiple colors you use in mixing those colors. So if you don't have a background or an understanding, at least a basic understanding of color theory, I would hop to those videos quick. We'll link them in this video because we're going to kind of jump to a couple of things that will help you with color mixing and color ratios. Another thing to think about with watercolor mixing colors is about granulating. So some colors will granulate or kind of separate once they're on the paper more than others. For example, Prussian blue and lemon yellow deep, opera rose and lemon yellow deep are some examples. And I really like that texture. I think it creates a fun, textured, nuancy look. Some people get really bothered by it, but you want to keep an eye out for that, and you can definitely continue to mix the wet combination on your paper so that it stays not separated before it dries. But if you're not picking that up and noticing it, then it will separate. But then other colors don't really separate. Like for example, Prussian blue, if I mix it with Scarlet Lake to make purple, those colors don't really separate. So let's just talk about ratios. So when we're talking about color mixing, we're thinking about ratios, we're thinking about consistency, and we're thinking about temperature or undertones. And doing a mixing chart more like this is going to give you a really good grasp of the colors in your palette and what undertones those mixtures will give you. But again, this is just combining two colors. You can combine, so for example, I have all of my colors laid out at the top and all of them laid out on the side. So this first mix is just lemon yellow deep together, then lemon yellow deep and yellow ochre, lemon yellow deep and cadmium orange, lemon yellow deep and opera rose, lemon yellow deep and Scarlet Lake, Prussian blue, etc., all the way down my palette. And then for the same colors across here. So this is a really great exercise to do in understanding the undertones and what you get as a result from mixing these two colors in your palette in 50-50 ratios. However, there's so much more that you can get from just these 12 colors I have in my palette with the consistency or lightness and darkness of the value of the color, but also the amount of the ratio. So if I have, for example, only 25% or 10% or whatever lemon yellow deep in my mixture, it's going to give me a much different result than when I have 50-50 Prussian blue and lemon yellow deep versus 75% lemon yellow deep and Prussian blue. So play around with those exercises and a mixing chart like that to get a good sense of what colors you have in your palette. But some colors will really surprise you, some mixtures. So I'm just going to mix up a simple mixture of Prussian blue and Scarlet Lake. I've got like a milky consistency here to pull out what we did in this exercise. So then I'm going to rinse that Prussian blue off in my water cup, and I'm going to grab some Scarlet Lake. And this is when you become an observer. Actually, throughout your entire experience, when you sit down to paint, you're an observer more than you are a painter. But looking at the consistency and also the hue or the color in my palette. So right now, with the amount of red that I have on my brush and mixed in with Prussian blue, I have a very cool temperatured purple. So if I want that to be more in the middle range purples, then I would grab a little bit more Scarlet Lake until I get that to move to a warmer, like in between purple. And if I want it to be a warm purple or red violet, then obviously I would grab more of that red. And then along with that, we're thinking about consistency. So if I'm going to my paper and I want to see it spread, and I'm maybe doing wet and wet technique and I want to see it spread really quickly and kind of like spread all over a bigger area, then I'm going to want to pay attention to the consistency of my mixture in my palette before I go to my paper as well. So this is going to give us kind of a milky cream consistency, and we have the hue is a very middle ratio of blue and red. So we're gonna try that on our paper. So we've got a milky consistency and a nice, it's a little leaning towards the cool temperature. And then with that, you can obviously lighten that consistency and get lighter purples or darker purples, depending on the consistency of the pigment and water ratios. But this is where you start to really need to become more of an explorer along with being an observer when you're painting with watercolor. So for example, what would happen if I added burnt umber to this color? We would get a really not smoky, but natural, I'm running out of brown, natural undertone to our purple. Let's see if that's enough. To our purple, and we would get this really beautiful, what would you call this color? Really beautiful purpley brown. I really wanted to come up with a more romantic name for this, but we're just gonna call it a really beautiful purpley brown. But look at the difference in hue with just adding a touch of burnt umber to the same mixture that we have. We have Scarlet Lake, Prussian blue, and I just grabbed a touch of burnt umber and we have this softened, beautiful purpley brown. And again, we can get a thicker consistency with more pigment if we wanted to, and darken it as well with more pigment in equal amounts, or if we want it to lean more brown or more blue or more red. So really studying with combinations of just two colors and seeing how it shifts the hue with adding one more color, or we can add a fourth color. Get really funky. Let's see what happens when we add yellow ochre. So this is going to be still in that somewhat brown undertone. However, yellow and purple are contrasting colors. So when you're color mixing, you want to think about, and this is why we linked to my color theory videos, but when you're mixing colors, you want to think about opposing colors on the color wheel, because contrasting colors usually makes muddy colors. So let's see what happens when we add yellow ochre. It'd probably be more drastic of a muddiness if we used lemon yellow deep, because it's a brighter yellow mixed with a brighter purple. And this is more of like a brownish undertone. But as you can see, mixing with the purple and yellow ochre, we're getting this grayish, murky purple, and there's nothing wrong with muddy colors. It's just going to give you a very different result. So we have this kind of murkiness or muddiness from this brownish purple. Purple is now just the undertone of this color. It's mostly brown, a brown gray. So again, if you want something to look more muted or murky, smoky, then you would add the contrasting color to like thicken it, darken it, and to make it a little bit smokier or muddier, whatever word you want to use. But these are just some of the examples of ranges you can get with color mixing. So if you're using two color combinations, two colors together, so doing a primary color like blue and a primary color like red, or you could do red and yellow, etc. And then obviously getting a different value of that same mixture by doing a consistency ratio exercise, and then adding one maybe more neutral color to it to see how it affects the shade or how it affects the hue of the color. So for example, we used a brown. You could use black if we did, Prussian blue and Scarlet Lake again, a little bit more blue. Just show what a different neutral or color will do to the mixture versus brown. So black. A lot of people think, oh, to darken a color, I just add black, but that's not usually what happens. So sometimes black just takes out the saturation of a color and makes it like a gray. This is a purpley gray, which is beautiful. Beautiful color if you're painting and needing some grays. But if you want to darken a color a little bit more effectively and still keep the saturation of the color, I would recommend adding the contrasting color to it and just thickening the ratio or the consistency of the mixture so that it gets darker or more opaque. So now let's try this exercise with a different color. So maybe let's do, you can, if you have a mixing chart, you can see some colors that you maybe want to try out. I loved how Opera Rose and Sap Green came out together. Actually, let's do that. Opera Rose and Sap Green was a really surprising one for me because you think Opera Rose Pink is a version of, similar to red. Pink and red are similar almost in hue. So red and green are contrasting colors. So you think, oh, automatically I'm probably not going to like that because I don't really like muddy or murky colors. It's just not my style. But I loved this like soft kind of blushy brown we got from it. So I'm going to come up here to a somewhat clean section of my palette and get equal mixture of Opera Rose, equal mixture of Sap Green. Or actually, let's start with the least amount of Sap Green on my brush, or just a touch of Sap Green in this Opera Rose mixture. And it just mutes or, takes the edge off the neon quality of Opera Rose just a little bit and makes it like a really soft pink. And I love it. And then we're going to add just a couple swashes from my brush of green, which was a little bit too much. So we're going to add a little bit more pink. So now we've got like a pinkish brown. And again, we have different values inside of these mixtures with the consistency exercise. So you can add more water to make it a lighter value. And now we're moving into some greens that we could use in our floral paintings that are more natural or more sagey undertone, or browns for stems by using Opera Rose and Sap Green instead of just using burnt umber or whatever brown you have straight from the tube. So this is what opens up a whole world of exploration. Like, I love this green. It's a very foresty, smoky sage green. And we use Sap Green and Opera Rose to get this. Typically, when I'm mixing like a sagey green, I'll do Sap Green and burnt umber. But I love that you get this warmer pink undertone in this green. And then adding a little bit more green to that mixture. And you just get like the edge taken off of Sap Green a little bit. So it's not as bright green. It's a little bit more, there's a tiny bit of a brown undertone. So for color mixing, you want to think about a few things. You want to think about, obviously, the ratio of pigments, whatever you're mixing. So like I mentioned before, just a little bit of one color versus half and half ratios versus the opposite color having more in the mixture than the other. You want to think about undertones or the temperature of the color. So for both of these on this side, we're getting that warm brownish undertone. That's going to give you the more natural, organic looking look to your painting. So if you're doing a floral painting and you don't want it to be as vibrant or as saturated looking, maybe adding colors to your mixing that will make it more of a brown undertone. So that doesn't just mean adding brown to your mixture like we did for the purples. That could mean, pink and green together because they're pretty much contrasting colors, making it that undertone. And then again, thinking about how to soften or lighten a color with value and consistency. And once you start bringing in not just two combinations of colors, you want to kind of act like a scientist a little bit. So you want to put on your science hat a little bit. I don't know if it's actually science or what, but for example, the purple up here where it got really murky and kind of a grayish undertone, we added yellow instead of black. So contrasting colors usually mute and muddy the color. So if you want that, or you are noticing that your colors are getting really muddy, it's probably because you're adding a contrasting color, or brown or black will do that too. So keep in mind as you're mixing your colors, that you need to be an observer. You need to really look closely at the colors that you're referencing in a photo or a live subject or whatever you're looking at, and pull out the undertones, pull out the temperature, the coolness or the warmness, pull out the values, and then obviously the actual hue itself. So do you see pinks? Do you see reds? And really studying the differences between your pinks and your reds and your oranges, and studying the differences between yellow-orange versus red-orange versus orange 50-50 ratio. So I would recommend watching our color theory videos, but then also doing a chart like this. So you can pencil out a graph. I have 12 colors on top, 12 colors on the side. So however many colors you want to study, you can start with just 3. You can start with 1. Well, actually, no, that would be very boring. So don't just start with 1. 3 or 5, or you can go for all 12. So I've got my mini squares up here with 12 squares, and then everything in between. Used a ruler to space it out, but yellow and yellow, lemon yellow deep and lemon yellow deep combined, and then yellow ochre and all the way down. And it's the same order for the top and the side. And you'll get a beautiful chart, and you'll see a lot of fun mixtures that you never would have thought would have been a good combination without doing a chart like this. And then you can use this as reference. And then when you come to a color that is maybe surprising to you, or you want to explore a little more, then do a little ratio swatch. So for example, Opera Rose and Sap Green, like I mentioned, were really fascinating to me. The result was this with the 50-50 ratio up here. So I wanted to explore what it would look like if I added more green to it over time. And obviously we got more of like this brown, greenish brown undertone. Another fun combo I liked was Opera Rose and Burnt Umber. So this is the 50-50 ratio swatch here that was up here in the chart. And then I added more burnt umber slightly to each mixture as I made my swatches. And it gives you this brighter brown. It's not like a smoky brown, it's a brighter brown. And then Prussian blue and burnt umber was a fun, dark, really dark green. So obviously this is, if we added more sap green to this like here, it gives us a smoky green. This is also a smoky green, but this one is much lighter than Prussian blue and burnt umber, which this is Opera Rose and Sap Green. So there's a whole world of color just waiting for you to explore within your palette by doing these simple exercises like the mixing chart and pulling out these exercises, adding in different neutrals or even black and contrasting colors to see what comes of it. All right, so the third most common question I received about watercolor this year was about details and accents and adding in different textures, light and negative space. So I have a video on this channel that we'll link to here about negative space. And the thing with watercolor I've mentioned earlier in this video is consistency is going to be a have a big effect on the darkness and the lightness of the value, obviously. So the lighter or the thinner the consistency, the more transparent the color. That's the beautiful thing about watercolor is we don't use white to lighten our colors. We use water to make it more transparent, therefore more light. But if you're wanting to paint like a white flower, for example, or you're wanting to have white accents, you can use dry brush, like for example in this butter consistency, where you have the white of the paper poking through in a textury look. Or you can just paint the space around the flower if you're doing like a full big white rose, like in our negative space video that we'll link in here, that shows you how to paint a white flower. And then you can also go back and add white details, like for example with white gouache. We have quite a few videos where I'm showing you how to use white gouache to add an opaque white on top of your watercolor after your watercolor is dry. But that's for smaller details. So this whale shark that I painted for my upcoming book, I actually used drawing gum, which is like masking fluid. And I painted in his little speckles with a size 2 brush and this drawing gum, his speckles and the lines on his body of the shark. And then you wait for the drawing gum to dry and then you can paint over it, and it basically saves and reserves the white of the paper when you're painting over it. So then once everything dries, you peel this off and you have bright white paper where you painted the drawing gum or the masking fluid. However, sometimes I want to brighten it a little bit more, make the drawing gum a little bit crisper, so I'll go back over it and add some white gouache to some areas. And this is another way of using using drawing gum or masking fluid for this sea turtle. I put down the drawing gum on all these lighter areas on the ridges of his shell and on his like fins and face and body. And then once I painted over it and got rid of and took off the drawing gum, I did a glaze of a really light blue over his body so that it wasn't so bright, but it was much lighter and I didn't have to work backwards and just avoid all of these sections. So drawing gum is a great way for saving your accents or your lighter colors. White gouache, but it doesn't just apply to white. You could be wanting to add details to florals or to, for example, like this whale shark. Most of that requires a lot of patience and using a very fine brush, like a fine liner brush or a size 2 brush is what I mostly use for all of my detail work in flowers or in my subjects like animals and landscapes even. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the detail of your painting, what colors those are, noticing that from the exercises we talked about up here, but it's usually either your lightest colors that you're adding last or your darkest colors or details that you're adding last as your final step. Because with watercolor, if you want something to look really crisp, if you want a detail to not just blend into the background, like what you see here in this background, then you want to work wet and dry. So if I work wet and wet with these white details, and let's say the body of the whale shark was still wet, my white paint, even though it's gouache, would spread and diffuse and not be as crisp. And then same thing with this seascape scene. The darker details like on the rocks and some of the sprayed effect and the lines on the wave, they would just be blurry if I didn't wait until the base layer to dry. So for your details and shadows and fine lines and things like that, you're using a really fine brush, usually a thicker mixture if you're doing a darker detail, and then obviously a thicker mixture of white if you're doing white gouache. And you're being very patient with it and studying the subject that you're adding detail to, but making sure that your base layer for what you're adding your top layer to is dry so that you can get those really crisp lines or crisp dots or details. For example, for flowers, if I were adding a shadow detail to my flowers, I would take my size 2 brush and go up the petals and add in those fine lines, or I'd maybe even add a yellow or a white gouache to the center stamen area of my flowers to make those details pop. And again, this is all done with wet and dry. If you want more blending or diffused look to happen, you're not going to get a lot of detail, but you're going to get a lot of like natural shading happening in your flowers or in your seascapes or whatever you're painting using wet and wet. So wet and dry is for my crisp, punchy details with either my darker colors or my lighter colors or my whites. Another fun thing that you can do for getting details after you lay down some paint is what I did here in this crash and foam seascape thing. So I used a calligraphy pen, but you can also use an X-Acto knife. And you can basically, to get like a light flecks on your painting, you can awful noise and scrape off some of the pigment and you'll get kind of like a light effect. The X-Acto knife does it a lot quicker than a calligraphy pen, so I would definitely recommend, and then you're also probably damaging the calligraphy pen. But like up here where I scraped my calligraphy pen, you'll get these speckled light effects. You can also do that with a dry brush though. So if you're painting, for example, some light on the surface of water, this is just going to be super quick and basic. I'm not going to go through all the steps of, the base layers or anything, but you would use more of a cream or a butter consistency on your brush for a dry brush. And let's say I'm painting a seascape with some light on the surface. You can get some of that light effect with the drier consistency on your brush. So we have a natural way of leaving those whites on your paper by using a drier consistency on your brush. So there's our light source right here, and then you can go back in and paint in your waves with wet and wet. So with these details, or, your final steps of your painting, a lot of people stop too early. A lot of people, there is a fine line between overworking a painting and stopping too early. So it does take practice in developing and exercising that muscle of being an observer. That's the common theme with all of the questions I get with watercolor painting. It's always about becoming an observer more than you are the actual painter, because the more you can observe and train your eye to be more like a painter or an artist, the more natural it's going to feel from your hand. So with your details that you're adding, last steps that you're adding to your paintings, like the little white flecks or the shadow on the wave, or the darker details on the waves or the rocks or the flowers or whatever the subject is that you're painting, obviously takes a lot of patience. But this is really when you're before these steps, like for example, here's a great example because here's all the steps. I added masking fluid here to make sure the wave stayed crisp. But if you were to stop right here, it would look very dull, very flat, and very boring. But a lot of more beginner artists will kind of just give up at this stage and say, there's nothing I can do about it to make it look, more like the scene that I'm wanting. I give up. Or even if it's a flower, like stopping at the midtones and at the wet and wet stage and just thinking, I don't know what else to do. It's not coming out the way I want. I give up. But little details like the X-Acto knife or these tiny lines in the wave and the darker edges under the crash of the wave and the darker sections on the rocks and on the waves really do take patience and being a student or an observer of your subject, but they make all the difference in how the outcome of your painting or the result of your painting. So I guess my answer to the third most common question I get about watercolor, about adding details and light and all of that kind of stuff to your subject, there's so many different ways that you can do that. The masking fluid, drawing gum, X-Acto knife, negative space, and all of that. But all of these things really do require being an observer and patience. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that was helpful for you. But on top of that, we have a ridiculous amount of resources in addition to what we talked about in this video that expand on what we talked about. So make sure you check out the videos that we linked below. We have the Complete Beginner's Guide to Watercolor. There's multiple videos on my channel that cover, water consistency, color mixing, color theory, negative space videos for florals and different types of subjects. So make sure you check out all of those videos. We'll have them linked below if you want to explore this kind of technical stuff with watercolor and really get it down, because I highly recommend. It will help you turn your brain off if you really train your muscle memory in your hand and your eye to be an observer and to develop those techniques. It will really help you turn your brain off and all of that chatter because you have that foundational stuff down. So make sure you check out those videos and then let me know below if you've ever heard of this exercise before or if this was your first time hearing it and if it was eye-opening for you as eye-opening it was for me when I first heard it. And I will see you in the next video.